Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Unleashing Potentials podcast. Today's special guest is Cathy. Cathy, how are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. We're talking about the weather, how it's nice where you are, and here, not so much.
Yeah, so I'm in Florida, you're in Canada, so complete opposite ends of North America. And
Yes,
yeah, it's pretty beautiful outside right now.
I'm jealous.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you in the least.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Welcome to the podcast. I am just so excited to have you to talk about this very, very personal and also not too personal topic, if that makes sense. Because not
Yes.
everyone talks about it.
Yeah. So I think you hit the nail on the head. It is personal yet not personal because I'm willing to share my story publicly, but it's very personal when you have perinatal trauma
Mhm,
happen to you. When
mhm.
you go to the hospital or if you choose a home birth, if that's your plan, it's very personal when you go to the hospital to have a baby,
Mhm.
something millions of women around the world do every single day, and then you walk out pretty traumatized. That it really flipped our world upside down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm excited to hear more. Before we dive deep into this episode, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Catherine Garrett or Cathy. I go by either. I'm married to my husband Eli. We've been married almost 7.5 years. We have two little girls, Claire and Chloe Ann. They are the light of our life. They keep us busy every single day. Um, I I said earlier that my perinatal trauma flipped our world upside down because it unfortunately left me disabled. And so day to day, I do still pretty extensive rehab. Currently, I'm in cardiac rehab and neurological rehab. And then outside of being a mom and someone who attends rehab pretty regularly, I also have a podcast called the Birth Trauma Stories podcast.
Wow, that's awesome. And would
Yeah.
you say it was your experience that kind of ignite the passion in you to start a podcast?
Absolutely. So I had my severe perinatal trauma just over 4 years ago. And if you had told me 5 years ago I'd have my own podcast, I probably would have looked at you with like you had three heads. I'm not a technologically gifted person. I never thought of putting my story out there in this context. But more importantly, it really is an honor to come alongside my guests and, you know, hold space as they work towards healing
Mhm.
after their perinatal trauma.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. That makes two of us.
Yeah,
I
I
never thought
agree.
I'd be sharing my story
Yeah,
openly as well, but there's so much freedom and healing
I
when we do
agree.
that. Yeah. So take us back to when everything started for you when it comes to your.
So, so my perinatal trauma really started almost 5 years ago. So in January of 2019, we were kind of, my daughter was about 16 or 17 months old then. And we were kind of thinking about having a second baby. And I remember having the conversation with my husband of like, hey, I think I'm ready to start trying again. And I was already pregnant. And so I like to say we make a plan and God laughs. But I include my pregnancy in my perinatal trauma story because I really believe God was trying to prepare us for something. Obviously, at the time, we could not understand what it was. But looking back, there were multiple moments through my pregnancy where I really felt like God really took care of us. And, one big thing that he took care of us in is getting to the correct OB to get to the correct hospital that had the life saving measures to save my life.
Oh,
In
sorry.
particular,
Can you give me a minute? My cat
of
is.
course. Oh no, you're fine.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So one big part of my pregnancy where I feel like God was trying to protect us and prepare us for something was getting to the correct OB who delivered at the correct hospital to save my life. And there's a machine called X. Let me try that again. There's a machine called ECMO, and that's what I needed to save my life. And
Mm,
I currently live in Orlando, and at that time, it was the only hospital in all of Orlando that had this machine to save my life. So that was just one small piece of, I just really felt like God was protecting us. But let's fast forward several months. My pregnancy was amazing. I loved being pregnant. My first daughter was 8'10", and I'm only 5'1". So you can imagine that was a lot of baby for me to carry. So I was uncomfortable a lot. It Unfortunately, both times I was pregnant over the summer in Florida. So uncomfortable physically, temperature wise, all the things. But my second daughter was just over 7 pounds. So a much easier pregnancy. And I just had a wonderful time being pregnant with her. But I went into labor on September 18th, one day after my due date. And I remember it was a Wednesday morning. So I went to Bible study. That's what I do on Wednesday mornings. I don't think that any of the women in the room even knew that I was in labor or having contractions, but we get through Bible study. I went home to take care of my then 1-year-old, send my husband off to work. And around lunchtime that day, I called him and was like, I think it's time for you to come home. Contractions are getting more consistent. We need to think about potentially going to the hospital. And so obviously throughout this time, I'm in communication with my doula. She's giving me tips. I remember texting her, wow, shower felt amazing after she recommended a hot shower. I took a bath, trying to, just do all the things that you can do to work through those contractions in early labor. And then it was around like maybe 4 or 5 in the evening, we decided to start preparing to go to the hospital. So we dropped our then 2-year-old off at our pastor's wife, let me try that again. We dropped off our then 2-year-old at our pastor and his wife's house. They agreed to take care of her until my mother-in-law could drive. She lives about 2 hours from us. So we obviously called her as well and said, hey, we're heading into the hospital soon. Just to give you a heads up on when you should get your stuff together and get in the car. So after we dropped off my daughter at our pastor's house, we proceeded to the hospital. And I can't quite remember what time my doula arrived. I think it was at like maybe 7 or 8 in the evening. But we get to the hospital, we get settled in triage. They unfortunately did not have a labor room ready for me. If I remember correctly, at first it was they didn't have a nurse, and then they didn't have a room available. And so it was, we were in triage a long time. We were in triage for about 6 or 7 hours. So in my opinion, that was a long time, to not have the labor amenities that I thought I would have. But like I said, labor continued to progress, and about 10 o'clock the next morning. So now I've been having contractions for about 24, 26 hours. So obviously pretty uncomfortable. And I decided to get an epidural. So I got an epidural about 10 o'clock in the morning. And after the epidural, decided to take a nap, and napped on and off for the majority of that day. And then around 4:45 in the afternoon, 4:45 in the early evening, my husband said I woke up and yelled, "My heart is racing." So he proceeds to look at the monitor, and he saw nothing. So flatline, which my husband's incredibly calm in stressful situations.
Yeah.
So he didn't think anything of it. Monitors slip all the time in labor. So he just calmly walked into the hallway to grab my nurse. Her name's Christy. She's since become a member of our family. She's amazing. But so he goes to get Christy, and they walk back in, and I've gotten to hear Christy's accounts of what happened that day. And she said, as she walked in, she didn't even really notice that I was slumped over. Kind of in one swoop, she went to check for a pulse on my wrist and grabbed the blood pressure cuff. And when she went to touch my wrist, that's kind of when she noticed my hand had kind of a funny posture. Most likely I was having a seizure. And from my husband's account, as he walked in the room, he noticed me kind of slumped over. So after Christy noticed my hand, she grabbed my shoulders and like kind of shook me, trying to wake me up. And sorry, sometimes this gets a little hard to tell.
No worries. Take your time.
Um, yeah, so she kind of grabbed my shoulders, shouted my name several times, trying to get me to wake up. And when I didn't wake up, she called the staff assist button, the staff assist button. And that calls the labor and delivery team and then the NICU team as well. And at that point, as you know, 20 or so people are rushing in the room, my husband notices them moving the stuff away from my bed. And so he's like, oh, that's something I can help with. Because in his mind, if he can help and be a help, he can stay in the room longer. And so he jumps into action and starts doing that. And then he hears them calling, like, you know, do we call a code blue, or what is the next step? What do we want to do next? Because the thought with, so typically a labor and delivery team wants to get the baby, if there's a maternal code, the labor and delivery team and the NICU team want that baby out within 6 minutes, because that's when brain cells start to die. But it's actually twofold. So get the baby out to preserve brain cells, but then two, you have a massive I think it's called your abdominal aorta, right in your abdomen, and it relieves pressure off of that. So as the teams are doing CPR on the mother, it's helping blood flow profuse through the body better than if you have, a football in your stomach, basically.
Yeah.
So at some point they noticed family was still in the room, so someone shouted that, and then they escorted my husband and my doula out of the room, and my husband pretty much just collapsed on a bench he found in the hallway. And again, his thought process was, if I can see Cathy's doorway, I'll get information a lot quicker. And actually, I'm really, really grateful he did that, because he got to meet my daughter on the way to the NICU. If he had gone all the way out to the lobby, he wouldn't have been able to do that. So all of this is to say, I had a condition called an amniotic fluid embolism. It's where, so during pregnancy, amniotic fluid does get into the mother's bloodstream. That's a natural process. But for some reason, with certain mothers with certain pregnancies, the mother has what's called an anaphylactoid like reaction. Basically, there's this massive immune response to the amniotic fluid. And it doesn't have to be only amniotic fluid, it could be a hair cell, a nail cell, meconium, anything from the baby gets in the mother's bloodstream and then causes that immune response. And basically, your body just starts shutting down. And that's,
Wow.
Yeah,
You
that's why I needed CPR. What'd you say?
Quite the story that you have. Oh my goodness. Yes, that is trauma. That sounds very traumatic to go through. And I can only imagine how scary it was for your partner and family members. Wow.
Yeah.
When we have babies, it's supposed to bring so much joy, and which I'm sure it did, but the unexpected trauma and things that happened at that time. I had really, really terrible pregnancies. Like, I had severe preeclampsia. It was so bad.
Oh,
So
no.
I am traumatized also. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So now, have you healed completely? And you mentioned something about your heart and nerves. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I have a pretty small hole in my heart, but even what's considered a small hole allowed a blood clot to pass, and I had a stroke at the same time. So I was in a coma for 9 days and had, I think, 7 surgeries during those 9 days. And I would say the hardest thing to recover from was the stroke. Like, your nerves heal incredibly slow. It's like a millimeter a day or a millimeter a month. I can't quite remember, but it's extremely slow. And so I've made a lot of amazing progress. I'm doing things that my medical team didn't think I would be able to do, but it's been slow and arduous. I've been in rehab for 4 years now, doing speech, OT, and PT. And even had to do driving rehab to learn how to drive again, and so going from being a stay-at-home mom
Mm.
to waking up about 10-ish days later
Mm.
to being disabled, not able to sit up on my own. I also had open heart surgery. So you can just imagine the amount of pain I was in trying to just do daily functions.
Mm.
But, like I said, going from a stay at home mom to waking up and now you're disabled is it's a whirlwind. I mean, there's nothing short of it is a whirlwind. And
Mm.
it's been hard. It's been hard to figure out like my value, my purpose in this, post AFE life. And
Mhm.
often, so we have some support groups online for the AFE or amniotic fluid embolism community. And people, maybe 1 to 6 months out will go, when will I be myself again? And
Wow.
Bernadette, you might be able to speak to this as well. I don't think that you can go back to being yourself, the
No.
person you were prior to your perinatal trauma. I personally
No.
do not believe. But two, with that said, that doesn't mean God can't use it for his glory. And, he he's done incredible things. I mean, even just in saving my life, the doctors told my husband I had a 1% chance of survival. Like it was just, I mean, I get chills even thinking about that. It just at one point I had to go, we were talking earlier about that machine, ECMO. I had to go on the ECMO machine. And my husband said, well, after the last surgery, you came out and said, well, at least we didn't have to put her on ECMO. We're okay for now.
Mm.
Well, now my husband asked the doctor, well, now you've had to put her on ECMO. What's the next step after this? And the doctor says, there's nothing else we can do for her. It's literally up to her and God now. Like that's it. We have utilized every medical device out there to save my life. And
Mhm.
um, I really think it was my stubbornness that I get from my dad and just the sheer will to live. And, because I believe even though God has a plan for our life,
Mhm.
I believe we get a choice. You can choose his plan or not. And I've had people ask me multiple times, was it worth it? And this is a question that I really struggle with because our life has been hard. I mean, at that time, my husband and I had been married only 3 years.
Mhm.
It's just like you don't think about 3 years into marriage, your wife and your baby's life is in danger, and then now you're left with a 2-year old, a newborn, and a disabled wife. You don't think about that plan for your life. No one does. So yeah, it's not been easy. And
Mhm. Wow.
has it been worth it? I we were actually just talking with it in my Bible study about this topic last week. There's a woman named um, Joni Tata Erickson, and
Mm.
she at 16 dove into a pool and was left paralyzed. And so she's in a wheelchair, has had a really, really hard life. And in a TED talk recently, or cut that part out. I don't remember where
Yeah. Yeah.
someone was sharing with me of how um, Jody was speaking and said, when I look back at my life and I've been given the choice of being disabled or not, I would have chose the disability because it's allowed me to see God in more profound and real ways than if I'd not been disabled. And I remember telling my Bible study ladies, I don't know that I would say the same thing. And they were like, well, Cathy, you have to remember you're only 4 years into your recovery. Jody's had decades, like 5 or 6 decades to reflect on her life. And I was like, yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
But I think like the hardest thing for me personally, like as a stubborn, strong willed, like determined person, it's really, I don't want to say easy, um, less hard. It's not as hard for me to get up, go to rehab. I was doing rehab this morning before we recorded. There are days it's not easy, but overall, I'm just determined to do the things I have to do to achieve the goals that want to. But I think for me, the hardest thing is seeing the ways it impacts my family, you know, my husband and my kids. And anytime I talk about my kids or my husband, like I always get choked up because it's had a profound impact on all three of them.
Yeah.
And even my extended family, you can imagine, I shared with you earlier, I'm a twin. So you can imagine just what it's been like for my twin sister to, you know, see her sister on a ventilator and near death. It just is awful. But my husband and my kids in particular, prior to having my perinatal trauma, I wanted to be stay-at-home mom. I got to do that for a full year. It was amazing. Best job in my opinion. But two, I wanted to homeschool my kids, and
Mhm.
that was not in the plan, at least for not now. I'm hopeful that maybe God will open the door in the future. I don't know. We'll see. But like I said, the hardest thing for me to swallow is the impact that it's had on my kids and my husband. And, you know, I'm really, really, my 6-year-old is a mommy's girl. So I'm really close with her. And just seeing the ways that, you know, a couple years ago, and, you know, she was 4 at the time. So, you know, sometimes 4-year-olds just say things, but she said, you know, I love Auntie, one of our friends, we call her Auntie. She's like, I love Auntie better than you. And I'm like, well, why? And she goes, well, because Auntie can drive and you can't, you know, and it was kind of like, in her little 4-year-old mind, that was what was important to her. And thankfully, I've gotten my license back since then. But that was not an easy comment to swallow. And I just, like I said, it's really had a profound impact on my family. And that's,
Mhm.
for me being the person going through it, that's probably the hardest thing for me to cope with.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry you had to go through that and you're still going through it. You're a survivor, you keep fighting every day, and the work that you're doing is needed because most of us, we do think that, oh, pregnancies can be hard or easy, and but we never look at the traumatic part of it. Even after the baby comes, we get postpartum and we feel that all the attention is going to the baby, not necessarily to the mom.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, I can definitely relate with, you know, trauma and things that happens to us in life. And you're right, it can change someone. I can attest to this. I'm not the same person I was. I don't even know who or where she is, you know, going through lots of trauma and yeah, pregnancy traumas. But the big one for me was mental health issues, right?
Mm,
Like I don't know what happened to me, but it's a new person and it's a continuous healing journey.
yeah.
And I'm sorry you had to, you know, deal with the guilt because as moms, oh my, we do carry quite a bit.
Yeah, we do.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I had postpartum depression after my first daughter and didn't get help when I should have. And
Mhm.
I didn't realize that that delivery, when I was in it, on some level, I knew it was traumatic, but I never like verbalized or sought help until I had my second daughter. And I was like, oh, so this was obviously perinatal trauma. But looking back, like that was perinatal trauma as well.
Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, I know I had friends asking, like, how are you? Are you okay? But I wasn't honest. And it's really, our society does not uphold parents enough.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's really sad the way that mental health is stigmatized. I'm thankful it's changing, but
Mhm.
you know, change is slow and arduous and painful at times. But I think too, like we just need to be doing better for our parents and
Yeah.
offering support, whether that's tangible support like babysitting or you know, a meal or a ride somewhere. We need to be doing better. And several years ago, I had someone say to me, well, I don't really understand why parents need a break because they're the one who decides to have children. And this was a person who doesn't have children. I was like, well, it's very clear that you don't understand it because you don't have children.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
Wow.
God created us to be in community, not in separation. And I think that we saw that very clearly the last several years with the pandemic. We were not meant to be isolated.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm thankful that the tide is changing. We're offering better support, we're offering resources, but
Mm.
it is slow.
Very slow. I have schizophrenia, all right, and I still feel like society treats people like me like a
Mm,
monster or murderer who's gonna go out and get everybody, when really it just happened to me, and that's is something I have to live with. But you're right, we can do better, and I know
yeah,
many of us are doing the best that we can to provide support and relief to those who need it. Yeah.
yeah.
Speaking of, tell me some of the work that you do. Do you help parents? You have also have a podcast. Tell me more.
Yeah, so my podcast is called Birth Trauma Stories Podcast, and our tagline is We're holding space and finding light after perinatal trauma.
Mm,
So, my ultimate goal is to come alongside these parents
mm,
as they share their stories and hold that space for whatever comes up that day. Sometimes we're on the podcast laughing, sometimes we're crying,
mm.
sometimes there's grief, as my episode just last week was a dad who unfortunately lost his wife to a maternal health crisis.
Ooh,
So yeah, I'm just trying to create space that, although our perinatal trauma stories are not rainbows and sunshine, they're still they are still stories that deserve to be told.
mm,
And I also host, it's called the Trauma Tribe. I host a peer support group once a month. I always lead with I don't have any credentials, but I just hold this space that if you want to show up and share your story and share what's heavy that week,
mhm,
that's what the space is for. And I'm really thankful for the ladies. We haven't had any gentlemen show up yet, but I'm thankful for the ladies that show up month after month to just support each other. Like it's really beautiful to see.
mhm. Yeah. That must have been a powerful episode to interview a man and to hear
Yeah.
his story and perspective. Also a very tragic story and sad. Um, What
Yeah.
was he the first male that you've interviewed with similar stories?
So I've interviewed one other dad. He was a NICU dad. So not a maternal death, but still perinatal trauma.
Mhm.
Um, so yes, that was the first dad that I interviewed who had lost his wife to she had an infection that killed her after having his son was like 6 days old when his wife passed away.
That blows my
Yeah,
mind, and it's so sad. It's so sad.
it is.
But I know the work you're doing is so needed and so profound and powerful. And I'm grateful we're having this conversation because I know your story will help other people,
Thank you.
just with trauma in general. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
what's next for you in your journey? What
that's
are
a
you
great
working on?
question.
Mhm,
It's interesting. So September is when my perinatal trauma happened. And recently I was having coffee with a friend and she was like, as you look forward, what are you planning for? And it was kind of like the question really took me aback because we're kind of, like I said, we just hit the fourth year and we're kind of at a page that, or we're kind of at a point where we get to pick and choose, what rehabs I do, what I don't. And it's really kind of the turning of a page in my recovery and in my story. So looking forward, I'd love, to grow the podcast even more. I eventually want to get my certification to be a birth story healer. And that sounds a little woo woo, but it's not. It's you just hear you hear the person out and you kind of pick you tend to like hear kind of the same theme over and over again and you just kind of help that person work through the birth trauma on a more personalized level.
mhm,
But in my recovery, I don't know what's going to come up. Can we just cut that part out?
Yeah,
We'll
yeah,
just talk about the podcast because I have no idea what my recovery is going to look like going
yeah,
forward. And
yeah,
my
yeah.
medical team is actually trying to decide like what it looks like going forward.
Yeah. How do you practice self-care day to day?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm not great at practicing it day to day. I will say I'm really pretty good about doing my Bible study every day, or at least turning on some worship music. Music really speaks to my heart and really uplifts my spirits. And even before we recorded, I was doing a little bit of crafting. I love crafting so much.
Ew.
I'm I'm my 6-year-old's room mom. So that's kind of, like I said, a turning of a page. Like last year, my rehab schedule didn't allow me to really do
Mm,
school functions and be really involved with my kids' school. So yeah, it feels really good to be in a place that, I get to volunteer at the kids' school. And but even in that volunteering, I have to limit myself. I usually only do like 2-hour shifts and then I go home and rest. It
yeah.
can be really a lot on me physically. Yeah, so self-care. I also love lavender baths, like with some Epsom salts,
Yeah.
light a few candles, turn on a little music, and just soak for like 20 minutes. Obviously, physical activity. I try and get out and walk or going to rehab. I mean, that counts as physical activity. I'm really, really blessed in that the rehab team that I have around me currently, I really, really love. Like our personalities get along really well. And yeah, we just, even though we're working hard, like we have a great time doing it. And so I'm really thankful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You describe what I do regularly, which is,
Really?
yeah, because I have chronic pain 24/7. So Epsom salt, crystal, and I don't know, some type of candle or smudging. And I paint and sing and podcast. And
Wow.
yeah, just keeps me going and it helps quite a bit.
Yeah.
And definitely mindset. Mm. If like I have to constantly filter my thoughts and what's coming in or what I keep. That's the only
Yes.
way I can function. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. I too have struggled with depression and anxiety in my past.
Mm,
And, taking every thought captive. I struggle as well with chronic pain. And there's nothing quite like being in pain 24/7. It's often, in when I look back at the course of my life, I didn't realize at the time how easy I had it. And, just dealing with, so I had surgery to save my legs. And so sometimes it can be painful for my kids to even sit on my lap.
mhm.
And, just like taking those little things for granted, and I try really hard to not allow my pain or my disabilities to affect my kids. But, I push myself too hard until it gets to that point of like, all right, I need you to get up, which is
Yeah.
hard. My kids are really good at respecting boundaries, but let's be honest, they're still like 4 and 6 years old and, have their own set of emotions. So sometimes it can be sad to ask them to get up and, because my legs hurt. But typically when I tell them, like, well, it's because they hurt right now, I need you to get up, then they're like, okay. And then they just get up. But it's, it's so my point being though, I applaud you as well. Like dealing with chronic pain 24/7 is just it's exhausting in and of itself.
Yeah.
And I think many people don't realize that people living with chronic pain are trying to act normal. And so even though you or I may have a huge smile on our face, does not mean we are not in pain.
Yeah.
You just to some point you get used to it and you're just kind of like, this is part of my daily life. This is what I deal with. These were the cards that God dealt me and I'm just going to push forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Like literally. And at times I find that people who either are ignorant or have their own opinion, they do judge us who
Mm-hmm.
have pain. For me, I used to have severe insomnia. I had to be hospitalized when I was so sick. And I go to bed early. All right. And I
Mm-hmm.
have a routine, a set schedule. My mind knows what to expect and my body does. But, I've been told, you go to bed so early. And I have to explain why I go to bed early and why I do the things I do. But it is what it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're taking care of yourself. And at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Two questions for you before we wrap up. First one, what is the meaning of life for you?
Ooh, what is the meaning of life for me? Glorifying God,
Mm.
definitely.
Oh, I love that. Where can my listeners find you and support your work?
Oh, so I have my own website. It's www.birthtraumastories.com. And you can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all birth trauma stories. So just search birth trauma stories, and I'll be on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook.
That's awesome. Do you have any final words of encouragement or anything we didn't talk about you'd like to touch on quickly?
I would say hold space for your own emotions as well. Many times I've had people reach out to me and say, well, your baby survived. You shouldn't be sad that, you're hearing their cries through a phone because they survived. It's okay for me to be sad that that's the first time I heard my daughter cry. It's okay. And my heart goes out to those families who, unfortunately, their babies did not survive, but it's okay to hold space for your own emotions as well.
Well, Cathy, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for doing what you're doing because it's needed.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thank you for what you're doing as well. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
You're welcome.